Saturn in Aries is at war with the past. Or rather, she's occupying the past, sort of like an invading force or army. It's like Mars is the battle and Saturn is the occupation. Saturn is order, and Aries is violence. And when you put those two together, you get tyranny. This is Saturn, girl, and we have a big transit happening. I know I always say that, but this time it's for real. I'm like the girl who cried Saturn, and it's Saturn who's about to shake up our current situation. That's right. On May 24th, Saturn, my malevolent matriarch and namesake, will enter the sign of her fall, the arrogant Aries. And this will be the first time she's occupied Aries since the mid to late 1990s. Grunge, goth, and girly pop. And new metal. Marilyn Manson, the Spice Girls, Limp Bizkit. Oh my! In this video, we're going to be talking about the meaning of Saturn in Aries. And at the end, we'll be doing your horoscopes for the occasion. So make sure you watch this whole dang thing. Now you may have some sand in your naughty bits about me referring to Saturn as feminine. Why do I do this? Because I can. If you got a problem with it, just look up and scream. I'm sure the Lord will listen. Moreover, the ancient astrologer Dorotheus of Sidon wrote, in his 1st century astrological work, known as Carmen Astrologicum, listed Saturn as one of the feminine planets, which actually makes sense because then you would even up the gender scheme among them. You'd have an equal number of masculine and feminine planets. We know Venus as the maiden, the moon as the mother. And I think of Saturn as the crone. Yeah, the crone on the phone. I mean, that's me when I'm, calling my brother. In ancient astrology, Saturn was considered the enemy of the sun, or God, because the sun was God, and therefore came to symbolize things like destruction, chaos and borders, time, old age, and death. Whereas the sun represented spirit, revelation, transcendence, and youth. In the Vedic tradition, Saturn was associated with Kali, the goddess of time, death, and destruction. However, she was also associated with divine motherhood and liberation. In addition, the ancient Greek goddess Hecate is also related to Saturn through her roles as assisting with both childbirth and death. You see, in the ancient world, those two often came together, sort of like a painful McDonald's combo. I wonder if the bubonic plague was a supersize me scenario. Anyway, I don't want to beat a dead horse because that's Mars's job. And of course, Saturn is entering a Mars-ruled sign, which is very uncomfortable for her. That's because she's the furthest visible object and therefore considered cold, dry, and slow-moving, whereas Mars is bright, active, hot-headed, and impulsive. Mars represents action, conflict, and clean breaks, like Saturn, on the other hand, represents slow, protracted struggles, confinement, and gradual separation. Aries, of course, begins the zodiac at the spring equinox, which is like the rebirth after the cold, dark death of winter. This is where the nights no longer dominate the day, and the light begins to prevail again. In the northern hemisphere, of course. Meanwhile, Saturn is most happy in the cold and dark. So she's not happy when she enters a hot sign that starts forcing her to do things and expose herself. I guess old ladies exposing themselves is an acquired taste. But I've got really bad mommy issues. However, the transition of Saturn in Pisces to Aries represents a particular theme. You may recall my video from a couple of years ago when Saturn entered Pisces, and I referred to it as facing hard truths. I would also add that Saturn in Pisces also represents a descent into chaos and dissolution in the void. It's like waking up from a hangover and having to deal with all the grim realities that we've avoided. Mars is active and impulsive, whereas Saturn is adverse to action. So when you put the slowest planet in a Mars-ruled sign, what you get is a slow, toilsome struggle to escape prison. She represents clawing her way out of chaos in order to establish a new order. Saturn in Aries is at war with the past. Or rather, she's occupying the past, sort of like an invading force or army. It's like Mars is the battle and Saturn is the occupation. Saturn is order, and Aries is violence. And when you put those two together, you get tyranny. Pisces, on the other hand, is a Jupiter-ruled sign, and therefore has to do with contemplation. And it's that period leading up to spring, so it's also like gestation. It's the liminal space between the death of the winter solstice and the birth at the spring equinox. And the end of winter represents a boundary between the darkness and the light. Jupiter is the bridge between the inner and the outer worlds, between the material and the spiritual, the objective and the subjective. He's the way of higher understanding that transmutes the knowledge of Mercury into the wisdom of love. However, Aries is where we apply all these lessons through action. So that begs the question, can we see these themes expressing through Saturn and Aries transits? Well, let's look at 3 previous ones. First, we have the mid to late 1930s, which represented a few slow and toilsome struggles. We had the consolidation of Nazi power in Germany, as well as the struggle of the New Deal efforts in the United States. During Saturn and Pisces, Jews and other minorities became a question in Germany, which really just means a problem that needs to be exterminated. Of course, this was a lie, not the truth. But as Joseph Goebbels said, a lie repeated often enough becomes the truth. And remember that Saturn in Pisces also has to do with deception. Then came the imposition of tyranny, through the slow, toilsome struggle of Saturnian imprisonment and concentration camps, which were an agonizing demise for millions of people. And it was only when the camps were liberated that the world became aware of Nazi war crimes. On the other side of the Atlantic, the hard truths of economy and capitalism brought the immiseration of the poor, the unemployed, the elderly, and children to our popular awareness. The New Deal reforms really took off under Saturn and Pisces, when we got the Social Security Administration, and the dangers of wealth inequality became abundantly apparent to us. However, Saturn and Aries brought the second New Deal reforms, which erected the new American social order. It's when we got the 40-hour work week, the right to form unions, minimum wages, and the end of child labor in the United States. This was the original occupation of Wall Street. Then, when Saturn was in Aries in 1967 and 68, we transitioned from the civil rights movement to establishing structures that would advance the interests of the Black community. In fact, this is when the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People began, otherwise known as the NAACP. Then we got the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which effectively ended segregation in housing and increased living standards for Black families and children. We also had the backlash to civil rights victories, which were evident in the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy. Remember earlier, I also mentioned how Saturn rules boundaries and borders. And 1967 was the year of Israel's Six-Day War against a coalition of Arab states. And that resulted in the establishment of Israel's 1967 borders, which have been gradually expanding ever since, bringing us to the current conflict. And this conflict will likely reach a climax during this Saturn and Aries transit. Then in 1996 and 1997, we had more attacks on New Deal reforms from the 1930s. During that Saturn and Pisces transit, Bill Clinton and the Democratic Party abandoned the labor movement and the working class, looking for support from big finance and the tech industry. There was a full-on demonization of the working class and the poor. Then when Saturn entered Aries, we saw the imposition of anti-New Deal legislation like welfare reform, that hurt children and working families. But it wasn't just the poor who were demonized. It was all minorities and marginalized communities in the United States. Prior to this, civil rights struggles had increased the visibility of oppressed peoples and resulted in more political influence. Right-wingers called this political correctness, which really just meant they wanted to be able to harass minorities with impunity again. This is when made-up propaganda about welfare queens mooching off the system became a justification for removing social programs that lifted millions out of poverty in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And of course, you can see all these events connecting to our current situation. Now we have the organized backlash to political correctness, now known as the culture war. Why do I do so many finger quotes? What am I, a Tyrannosaurus Rex? Now we have a struggle to end the remaining New Deal reforms, like Social Security, which lifted millions of seniors out of poverty and homelessness. We have an attack on civil rights of all forms, women's rights, queer rights, immigrants' rights, the rights of people of color in the United States, and other oppressed nationalities. And on top of that, the struggle between capital and labor is approaching a climax. All the hard-won victories of oppressed and vulnerable communities are under attack right now. And it's all of our duty to participate in the propagation of progress and the establishment of a more just and inclusive society. And now it's time for your horoscopes. And remember, I do these for each rising sign because that's what determines your houses. But if you don't know it, you can watch for your sun sign instead. So check it out. We're filming today on May 21st, and Saturn is here at 29 Pisces. And you can see my mother moving forward. And boom! She's fallen into Aries and she can't get up. Or, she can't get it up. That would make sense. I mean, she's not transpersonal, so maybe she's just trans. So let's start off with Aries Rising, shall we? This means Saturn is entering your first house of self, of body, the whole you, mind, body, and spirit. Now, I went through this in, 2021, 2022. You see, we go through an identity crisis of sorts. It's like we get faced with parts of ourselves that we haven't dealt with before. Now, of course, there's a physical component. We start to feel, chronic illness issues. We might get sick or have persistent health issues. But also, on a positive side, sometimes we can lose weight. Now, also psychologically, we become more and more aware of our mortality, of maturity, and we get the explicit sense that someday we will die. However, this also gives us more strength, you see, because Saturn in the first house teaches us how to live a more authentic life. The lesson here is to face yourself with a sense of sincerity, honesty, and truth, because the worst thing you can do is lie to yourself, It was during my first house Saturn transit that I came out as trans, so... I'm not saying you will, but I am saying that you will be faced with parts of yourself that you haven't dealt with. But let's move on to Taurus Rising. And that's our Taurus Rising friends. So for Taurus Rising, this means Saturn is entering your 12th house. Now, I went through this in, 2018, 2019. And this represents a sense of isolation and facing self-destructive behavior. Sometimes we actually get taken out of public life. For me, it was when my divorce was happening and I had to move in with friends out in the country in the boonies. So I was literally exiled, you see, and this represents a sense of exile. But also, like I said, self-destructive behavior comes to the fore. We get a sense of separation, isolation, and loneliness. But oftentimes, this brings up the lessons that we've avoided that we're going to face during the first house transit. Let's move on to Gemini Rising, our Gemini Rising friends. Now, this means Saturn is entering your 11th house, right? And the 11th house is hopes, wishes, friends, and supporters. And this often represents cynicism. We go through a period of cutting ourselves off from people, feeling unsupported, feeling isolated from our typical groups or like-minded people. It's kind of depressing. It's like, what's the point here? But the lesson is to learn how to get that sense of security from yourself. When you don't have supporters, who's going to support you? You! You're going to support you. And it's not like you're supposed to cut yourself off from people here. It's learning self-reliance to a certain extent before you can integrate once again with your groups and then face the lessons of isolation in the 12th house. But let's move on here to Cancer Rising, which puts Saturn entering the 10th house. And this is a transit that can feel quite depressing or stagnant in our professional or public lives. Usually, we hit a wall in our career or a glass ceiling. We feel stuck and trapped, or like our chosen life path or life direction doesn't make sense for us anymore. It's like, why am I doing this? We get a sense of meaninglessness from our work, and we might get a bad reputation. I know when this happened to me, I didn't get the job I wanted. I was supposed to manage 2 restaurants, I was supposed to be a career girl, but it didn't work out. However, I also segued into a new career path, which eventually brought me to starting my own business. So that's the wonderful thing about Saturn in the 10th house, is the last little bit oftentimes will be like the light at the end of the tunnel, and we'll get put on a new path that makes more sense for who we are becoming. But anyway, let's move on to Leo Rising, which puts Saturn going into your 9th house. And this is the transit where what we believe is eroded or dissolved. We become disenchanted with what we thought, believed, or our previous ideologies. It might be spirituality. It might be politics. It could be the occult or arcane subjects, or just religion in general. Oftentimes what we do is we start investigating new philosophies or new ways of thinking. Sometimes Saturn going into the 9th house can bring us a mentor or someone who dissolves those beliefs, who attacks our beliefs, and shows us the weaknesses in what we thought and believed before. This is the transit where you establish a new worldview. I was raised in a very conservative, Republican military household. And it was at this time in my life that my politics totally changed. So be ready for a reorientation in your worldview. But let's move on now to Virgo Rising. Now that's put Saturn going into your 8th house of losses, death, but also inheritance, credit, gifts, investments, and then debt and taxes. So when Saturn goes into your 8th house, my dear Virgo Rising, you need to save your money. This is about debt. It's about losses. And it's about learning to let things go. So I just heard about one person who got saddled with a bunch of debt or just, had collection stuff pop up. This is a frequent thing. Sometimes we face a very literal death of someone close to us. That's sort of like the most extreme permutation, but it does happen. Now, frequently what I see more happening is having to face trauma, stuff that we've suppressed or avoided. We put our secrets and our hidden things in the 8th house where we don't have to look at them. And when Saturn goes into the 8th house, those several years become really morbid introspection. They can also force us to see what isn't serving us anymore and to let go. The 8th house is also about forgiveness, right? So as trauma becomes evident, as we start to process it, which is very uncomfortable and depressing, isn't it? Then we start to forgive, right? The 8th house is about forgiveness and reconciliation as well. Now, forgiveness is for you. It's not necessarily, excusing the stuff people have done to you, but it is learning to let go of hurt, right? Because these things hold us back. Resentment is very Saturnian. and resentment can hold us back from a more fuller expression of ourselves and our values, right? And also watch out for criminal behavior or theft, okay? So the key thing here is save your money, manage your resources. But let's move on here to Libra Rising. So for Libra Rising, this means Saturn is entering the 7th house of partnerships, marriages, relationships. And not just romantic, but also business and oppositions. Now, when Saturn goes into your 7th house, oftentimes we have one of two scenarios. Either we have a relationship starting to gradually end or separate, or we have a deepening of commitment. That's what happened to me. Under this transit, it's when I moved in with my ex-partner, right? So it was a very much a deepening of commitment. The other thing about it, though, too, is we can get a sense of feeling trapped in relationships. So if you feel that sense of commitment may not be such a good idea. And it will probably blow up in your face later. Now, the other thing about Saturn going into the 7th house is it creates long oppositions or protracted competition. You may be competing with someone in your industry or job field. It may be a legal battle with someone. Usually it's an ex-spouse or partner, right? But the other thing that happens too is this sense of independence, right? I mean, it's different from the 11th house. That's like friendly independence. This is romantic independence. You may have an issue with codependency that needs to be addressed. And that only comes from finding your own value within and not from relationships. But let's move on here to Scorpio Rising. So for our Scorpio Rising friends, this puts Saturn entering the 6th house of injuries, illnesses, health, work, obligations, and small animals, right? When Saturn enters the 6th house, it's sort of like having to take responsibility for all the stuff you avoided over the previous few years, right? It's like you have to put all the pieces back in order. You have to pick up your life. You have to clean up the broken pieces and do one thing at a time, right? Sometimes we do face health struggles. Sometimes we have to start treatment for an illness or have a long healing process. You know, broken bones or whatever, healing from surgeries. And remember, surgery is a Mars type thing, which is Aries, and Mars rejoices in the 6th house. So it's a very Mars house. Now, the other thing that happens too is establishing a new lifestyle, right? Which will promote your health. And this could include things like diet, exercise, and sleep. Rather than diet, I prefer to say nutrition. Because you have to make sure you're getting enough nutrition. And it's not necessarily about depriving you of things, but substitution for better things. So anyway, now the other thing too is you may have issues with your pets or animals. They may get sick or have issues. Or, you know, the worst case scenario is having a loss of a pet. It does happen, but once again, that's a more extreme permutation. So just remember that it's most likely going to be your health and healing. But let's move on to Snagimattarius Rising. So for our Snagimattarius Rising homies, this means Saturn is entering your 5th house of children, sex, fun, enjoyment, right? Games and pleasure. It's Venus is joy, you see? So it's known as the pleasures of the flesh. Now, when Saturn goes into the 5th house, it doesn't feel fun. It feels stressful. It feels like you can't have fun because you're busy putting out small fires here and there. It's very chaotic. It's hard to bring order to your life, which happens in the next phase when Saturn enters the 6th house. But we also have issues with our children. You know, our children could be going through a bullying issue at school. They could have trouble at school. They could be dealing with mental health or emotional or whatever issues. But the key thing here is learning to schedule yourself time for enjoyment, scheduling downtime. Because if you don't, you're just going to be busy, stressing, and running around. So, you probably heard the phrase like, we're going to have fun whether we like it or not, damn it. And that's the kind of thing. You have to force yourself to have a little bit of fun. Because otherwise, it's going to be quite depressing. And if you don't have children, there could be difficulties during childbirth or during pregnancy, or you may find out that you have fertility issues or whatever. Those happen. But again, they're more extreme permutations of this. So let's move on here to Capricorn Rising, our Crapricorn Rising friends. So this puts Saturn going into your 4th house of the home, the family, the father, origins, right? Now in modern astrology, they'll say the mother, but it could be both parents, really. In ancient astrology, it was mostly the father because, patriarchy. So anyway, when Saturn goes into our 4th house, we feel alienated or estranged in our own home. A good example of this is one of my clients during her 4th house Saturn transit had to move in with her mother to take care of her, right? Again, parents, and the home. So she became her live-in, healthcare. And that became a toilsome struggle for that client. Now, what also happens is we have struggles buying a home or finding a new place to live. We feel estranged from our past or our homeland. Sometimes we lose our sense of our allegiance or loyalty to certain things, whether it's our family, our ancestors or origins, or our nation of birth. You see, the 4th house is also land. So you could lose something, you could lose some land, or there's something that ties you to it, like you can't escape it, you see? So just watch out for these things. Oftentimes it's our parents that are involved if they're still alive. So just be aware of that. I think this happened to me when my parents were sort of, having issues when I was younger. But anyway, let's move on to Aquarius Rising. This is me, Aquarius Rising, which means Saturn is going to our 3rd house of communication, messages, learning, primary school, also siblings, extended family, and our local communities. So I'm a little worried about this, because I'm worried about like an uncle or a cousin having a severe issue. Issues with my brother, maybe, I hope not. But yeah, people pop back into our lives from our extended family, or they have problems we need to help address with them. Oftentimes, it can feel like our voices are stifled. I know for me, I'm slowly being pushed off of many social media platforms. And Saturn in the 3rd house is censorship, or, restraining our expression. And I'm already starting to feel this. Now, the other thing it is feeling rejected in our own communities. And I know being trans, it sure feels like that's happening more and more. When this happened to me when I was younger, though, I was in middle school and I was having issues with math. And I had to go into tutoring, which is very Saturn in the 3rd house. So be aware of those. If you're younger, it could be school stuff. If you're older, it'll probably be more family stuff in your community. And your ability to express or communicate. But let's move on to our final sign here. Pisces Rising. Oops, too far. So for our Pisces Rising friends, this means Saturn is entering the 2nd house of money, resources, and, our material stuff, our belongings, our possessions, and also our livelihood. So when Saturn enters the 2nd house, like it just did for me over the past couple of years, we're faced with our inability to manage our resources. We may find ourselves losing money or having big expenses. If you're a small businesswoman like me, then it'll be hard. I know it was really hard for me establishing, a rhythm and, being consistent about checking my finances and keeping records and spreadsheets. All of that was new and foreign to me. Like budgeting, what is that? Like, what does that even mean? And that is the key word for Saturn in the 2nd house. Learning to budget yourself. And really it has to do with being aware and judicious with your material resources, right? Because those are what sort of give you the ability to live and move and have a certain amount of freedom in the world. And if you're restrained in any way, right? You're going to have a bad time. You're going to feel a sense of poverty. You're going to feel, now, I wasn't in poverty. I was fine. But I was really stressed about money, you see? So it can create this sort of false sense of scarcity. Now, many of us have real scarcity in our everyday lives. So if that's you, please be careful. And believe me, it's very easy to get depressed about this stuff, but it won't help. You know, it's okay to fall to pieces for a little bit. Pieces of Pisces. What we're really being asked to do during this transit is to get our life in order, right? Our material life, to learn to manage our resources, to be more effective people, and it can help us be more generous as well. So, otherwise, Saturn in the second house can be quite stingy. Anyway, I hope this all was useful. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and watch all my other videos because they're really good. Thank you for watching. Like this video and subscribe to my channel. And make sure to click the bell when you subscribe so that you get notified when my new videos drop. And I do the best readings. It's science. You can book through my website, saturngirl.org. And if you can't afford a reading right now, come to my live streams and get one for free. But you have to be subscribed to get notified about them. And please consider tipping me. It helps me make such wonderful content. You can give through super thanks below or become a member of my channel. And remember, I love you. You're beautiful. And have a wonderful, whatever it is you're having.